So thank you all for joining us for another Massachusetts Peace Action webinar, program. Tonight we are going to be talking about the recent Biden-Putin summit that took place in Geneva, Switzerland, just this past Wednesday, and also the threat of a U.S.-China Cold War. And we are going to be talking tonight with a very special guest, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. For those of you, it really doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you who might not know the Colonel, Colonel Larry Wilkerson is the Distinguished Visiting Professor of Government and Public Policy at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. His last position in the U.S. government was Chief of Staff to Colin Powell at the U.S. Department of State. He served 31 years in the U.S. Army, and he was also the special assistant to Colin Powell when he was the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, and later as Deputy Director and Director of the U.S. Marine Corps War College at Quantico, Virginia. So say hello to everyone, Colonel Wilkerson.
Hello to everyone, and thank you to the Massachusetts Peace Action Group for having me on again. I think this is the third time.
Yes, we actually had you speak in person back when that was possible. I believe it was in 2019. Colonel Wilkerson was the keynote speaker at our annual meeting, and it was a great one. That video is still online, and actually I'll include a link to that recording in the follow-up to a follow-up email following tonight's program, probably go out tomorrow morning. So just to start, I know it's a bit off topic, but I understand, Colonel Wilkerson, that you have a news item that you'd like to share with us regarding Cuba.
I do, and I thank you also for what I was briefed earlier before we came on screen with regard to your actions with respect to Cuba. Yesterday, sort of on a cold call from the new ambassador in Washington, head of mission, ambassador is her real title, Torres Rivera, Ambassador Torres Rivera. I had a meeting with her down in her embassy in Washington, and her plea to me was quite poignant. And I have been working on Cuba since I was head of the U.S.-Cuba project at the New America Foundation in 2009. And I like to think we helped President Obama finally effect somewhat of a rapprochement with Cuba when Raul Castro and he actually had sort of dueling press conferences and announced the results of what they had achieved. And we thought, hooray, we finally had achieved something with that island of 11 million really wonderful people, basically, off our coast, 90 miles off our coast. We've had a rapprochement with Vietnam, of whose people we killed 2.5 million in 10, 11 years of war. But we have no real significant relationship with this island that's positive. In fact, under Trump and Pompeo, we tightened the screws so dramatically and drastically that this ambassador's plea, as I said, was quite poignant. So my plea with you is keep up your work. And if you have time, call your senator, call your representative, visit them even, and tell them how stupid, idiotic, moronic this policy is that the United States, the empire, has towards this tiny little island 90 miles off Florida. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those words, Colonel Wilkerson. And just because you mentioned it, we will share some of the advocacy that we have done recently on Cuba in the follow-up email. And I encourage everyone watching to take that advocacy. We put that out as part of a 5-part series that we did on Cuba called Perspectives from Havana.
Muchísimas gracias. Many thanks.
De nada, de nada. But let's get to the subject at hand. I just first want to get your reaction to what you saw last week the meeting between President Joe Biden and President Vladimir Putin of Russia. What did you think of their first meeting of this new Biden administration? What would you have liked to see out of the summit? Did it live up to expectations? Was there anything positive that came out of it?
I actually think that the review that I read that encapsulated things the most efficiently and the most accurately was by Harlan Ullman, who, by the way, in The Hill, if you know that publication. And Harlan was the one man many, many years ago that Colin Powell called my attention to as a part of his experience at the National War College when he was a colonel. He said to me and gave me proof of that over time that Harlan was one of the smartest people he'd ever met, especially in national security affairs. So Harlan wrote this piece in The Hill, and I read many others that disagreed with Harlan, but I think Harlan encapsulated this almost tour de force by President Biden, following the exact opposite by President Trump and first Tillerson, but magnified greatly by Pompeo and Kushner. And by that, I mean, he went into a series of meetings that would challenge any president. He went to an EU summit. He went to a NATO summit. He went to a G7 meeting in Cornwall. I've been in Cornwall when it was flooded, but it's a beautiful place when it isn't flooded. And then he went to a Putin summit in Geneva. This is quite a challenge, but as Harlan pointed out, this is a man with 36 years experience in the Congress, including chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee and, more relevant, the Foreign Affairs Committee. And a man who spent 8 years, as did George H.W. Bush, the last really experienced president since Eisenhower under Reagan, as vice president. So how would we expect anything but at least some positive, if not a lot of positive, out of this series of meetings? And I think there was a lot of positive. There were some negatives too. The positives, I think, were the G7 in Cornwall made some decisions that it had been struggling to make for some time. The NATO summit, I would say, it probably had, as Harlan did in his piece, the only really, in my view, and Harlan's too, as I said, deeply disturbing aspect, and it can be modified as time goes by, but it was the attempt to get the NATO partners, now 30 in number, a very untenable alliance now, political and military, to get them to buy into the anti-China chorus, if you will. And many of them just simply aren't having it, thank God, in my view. So that was a wrinkle in the meetings. The big one, the meeting in Geneva with Putin, I think really turned out to be certainly positive, with maybe a burp here or there. But the working groups that were established will be the proof of the pudding. And I wanted to just make sure I get these right. One was on strategic stability, a huge issue. It includes everything from Ukraine to nuclear weapons. The second was on arms control per se, including nuclear weapons, of course. Another on cyber operations, another on Syria, and then others that reaffirm the Ukrainian process, however broken it might seem at the present time, and then others. But those were highlighted, and Harlan highlighted those too. And I think that's very important. I'm particularly encouraged by the fact, I know Putin wanted this. I think he actually brought it up in Helsinki, but nobody ever did a decent report, and Trump wasn't saying anything about it. He wants nuclear arms control because above everything else, with the possible exception of climate change, he knows that that's existential. We could ruin everything in a heartbeat with nuclear weapons. We still possess enough to destroy the world, destroy the planet and every human being on it. And we've eradicated all arms control, virtually eradicated it. I was ecstatic when I saw that one of the first acts was to extend New START, the only thing we have left for 5 years. Now we need to work on everything else. And eventually we need to bring in the other nuclear powers. We need to bring in North Korea. We need to bring in China. We need to bring Pakistan and India. And we need to bring in Israel. Badly, we need to bring in Israel and twist their arm until they come. I don't care if they come kicking and screaming. They need to come into the regime. Now, I'm talking probably a decade's worth of work here. But I think the Biden-Putin summit was a positive all in all. I wish some of the language that I heard and was transcribed, at least officially, I think, from the White House, was a little bit bellicose on both sides, but that's understandable. I'm glad that they sat down. I'm glad that apparently they had a good discussion. No one probably was better equipped to have that discussion on our side than Joe Biden. And I'm glad that there seemed to be some positive results of it. I'm going to see, as Biden himself said, we'll see in 6 months just how positive this was, particularly referring to the working group. So I'm optimistic.
That's good to hear. I was certainly optimistic when I heard about the formulation of those working groups, especially in regard to preventing what is of great concern to me, our organization, a lot of the activists on this call, and that is the potential for nuclear accidents, for an accidental nuclear war. Do you feel that that is something that both sides are really going to address seriously?
I certainly hope so. And as I indicated, primarily China in that regard, but Russia and China together, India and Pakistan right there close by, have to be a part of this. Because as you're probably aware, in 2002, we came very close to a nuclear exchange, and Colin Powell went to Delhi, and George W. Bush picked up the phone, and Rich Armitage went to Islamabad, and we sort of taught the Indians and the Pakistanis about all our history of nuclear deterrence theory and so forth and so on. We actually gave them permissive action locks for their weapons, which simply means in layman's terms that you need 2 keys. We were stunned at the naivete of both sides. So there are problems with nuclear weapons in the world outside the US-Russia relationship, but that's the huge one. That's where the preponderance of weapons is. And that's where the megatonnage and the yield is so vast that, again, we could destroy the world. No question about that now. If you listen to Daniel Ellsberg lately, he's very emphatic about that. And he's right. We would destroy the world. So I'm, as I said, I'm optimistic that maybe we're going to get this under control. Let me give you an example of just how difficult it is in this country, because the nuclear complex is a composite, a sub part of the military industrial complex, which has just become beyond Eisenhower's expectations, I think, ever. Just become so influential, so much playing in national security decision-making and in the warfare state we have become over the last 20 years. A potent part of that is the nuclear industry and the congressmen and congresswomen who support that nuclear industry. President Obama in his nuclear posture review and then in his budget put $1.2, $1.3 trillion towards new weapons. Let me give you an example of how silly some of this is. No, not silly, that's not the right word. How absurd some of this is. The Navy is now fighting the Congress because they don't want the SLICM-N. That's the submarine launch cruise missile nuclear. And they don't want it for a number of reasons, probably most prominently because it steals money away from other things they do want, most of those conventional. But think of this for a moment. You got a submarine out there and it opens its firing door and fires a missile. How do you differentiate, if you're a Russian or Chinese, how do you differentiate between that being a tactical missile, the SLICM nuclear, or that being a ballistic missile? The moment that door opens and you detect from your satellites that there's fire in the chamber and you get a little bit of the trajectory, you're going to probably fire yourself. So this is extremely dangerous, just as ballistic missiles on land are extremely dangerous because they're fixed targets. Everybody knows where they are. And so one of the things any nuclear power launching a first strike would do is take those out, take them out completely. So they're useless, really, and they cost billions of dollars, but they have an enormous part of this lobby behind them. And so it's going to be very difficult to do that. Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, in his book, The Button, along with Tom Kalina, says we should get rid of that leg of the triad. So talks over the next decade or so, I wish they could occur faster, to reestablish arms control are, next to confronting climate change, probably the most important thing we need to do. And I'm glad to see that we've got off to a good start, it looks like.
And we certainly agree with you there, and we oppose nuclear modernization, both by the United States and Russia, that will really tie us into this brinksmanship for generations to come, especially those land-based missiles that you referred to that are targets because of the use them or lose them mentality. It's really a leg of the triad that is more of a vulnerability than a strength or a deterrent at all. You mentioned New START. We applauded the administration for taking up the Russians on their offer to extend New START for another 5 years. What about the status of our other nuclear treaties? I was very dismayed to see a few weeks ago the United States say that they had no intention to re-enter the Open Skies Treaty, and now just in the past few days, the Russians have followed suit.
I think that was a stupid move. I can't put it any more bluntly than that. I think abandoning the INF Treaty, and let's go all the way back to my administration, abandoning the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, so we could build hundreds of billions of dollars of missile defense that technically we don't even know works. We still don't even know if it works. And this is a product of the military industrial complex and led by Lockheed Martin, the #1 death merchant in the world. Their sway, their influence, their power is so great with people like Jim Inhofe, people like Bob Menendez in the other party, that they can almost call the tune when it comes to things like this. And of course, the Secretary of Defense in our administration, Donald Rumsfeld, was a product of ballistic missile defense. He was an advocate for it all along, all the way back really to the Reagan administration. So we have put a lot of money into something that we don't even know works. We have convinced allies to take it. And frankly, it might be a pig in a poke. I mean, it might not even do what it's supposed to do, but it is extremely destabilizing. And this may be the most prominent negative aspect of it when it comes to dealing with arms control and dealing with someone like Vladimir Putin, or for that matter, Xi Jinping in China. China is on the verge of, and probably already has in its Central Party School, which gestates these strategic ideas and puts them up for the Politburo to decide on. It's already decided that we're nuts, that Mao Zedong, who said nuclear weapons are useless, I don't want to ever have any more than is necessary to deter other nuclear powers. His idea is passé now. Because of the desire to have a first strike capability, China is probably going to break out and build more nuclear weapons. All of this because of our missile defense apparatus and because of our inability to do what the Moscow Treaty in 2002, negotiated basically by my boss, said we would do, and that is by 2022, 2023, be it something like 1,200 weapons apiece. Instead, we're still at 4,000 plus apiece. So we arrested the progress contained in that treaty. And of course, we were actually helping the Russians destroy their weapons. We had teams in Russia helping to destroy their nuclear warheads. So we have reversed all of that progress to a certain extent and are heading in the other direction. The other thing the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty abnegation by George W. Bush did was start the process. It essentially said to the rest of the world, as I intimated Karl Rove said to Ron Suskind, that we're an empire and when we act, we make reality. It made reality. It essentially said to the world, we're through with arms control. Now we're going to talk about actually fighting a nuclear war. And indeed, that is what my military, your military, is doing today, actually talking about fighting a nuclear war, which is just patently absurd. All these years of experience and academic endeavor and analysis and so forth, and everything from RAND to think tanks all over the area and in Europe, gone. We can fight a nuclear war. That's all these tactical nuclear weapons mean, in essence, is they believe we can fight a nuclear war. That's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. If we go nuclear, we will go whole hog. And that's a very frightening prospect.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more, Colonel Wilkerson. And I would be remiss, since you mentioned his name, if I didn't say that tomorrow we're going to be joined by Daniel Ellsberg, who will be talking to us both about recent leaked documents about our nuclear policy regarding the defense, and I put that in air quotes, of Taiwan, and his concern about the anti-China rhetoric that is going on right now that prompted him to release those documents from all the way back in 1958. I believe that kind of thinking has no place in the 21st century, but unfortunately, it's all too relevant today.
Absolutely. Daniel is when he dies, Daniel will leave a visible warp in the fabric of time. He's a precious asset.
Well, I'm sure he'll be.
You can tell him I said that.
I'm sure he'll be thrilled to hear that praise. So we're going to include a link to register for that talk tomorrow. It's at 7 p.m. as well, and we're going to be talking to Dan Ellsberg. That conversation will be moderated by our board member and a great disarmament and peace advocate and activist, Joseph Gerson. But before we move on to U.S.-China relations, you mentioned negotiations on Syria that came out of this summit, and I want to pass the mic over to my colleague Amar Ahmad, who has a question for you specifically on Syria.
Okay.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so I have two quick questions on Syria. One of them is when we had Joshua Landis on and he was talking to us about Syria, he said that the US policy in Syria is to create a quagmire. That's the word he used, create a quagmire for Russia and Iran. So my first question is, do you agree with that assessment? And real quickly, the second question is, I understand you spoke recently to the UN about this Syria OPCW chemical weapons scandal. Can you just talk to us about that a little bit? What was that about? What did you talk to the UN about?
Two good questions. I think it's worse even, and I didn't hear what, this is not fair to Mr. Landis, but I think it's worse than what you just intimated that he said. I think the plan of the neoconservatives in this country, joined by people like Richard Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and others, was to set the Levant afire, to keep Israel's enemies so at one another's throats, whether it were Arab Persian or Arab or whatever, that would ensure they could not coalesce, they could not come together, combine, and give Israel trouble, militarily or otherwise. I think that was their whole plan. Now, I'm not saying every one of them was motivated by that purpose. There were other purposes that motivated, for example, the invasion of Iraq. But that was the ultimate plan. And I saw plans in the Pentagon for continuing beyond Iraq. They thought Iraq would be over in 55 days or less. Syria was next. And then whoever happened to be the propitious target of opportunity was next. It could be Iran, it could be Lebanon, it could be Egypt, it could be anybody in the Levant, as long as it kept the place afire and therefore protected Israel. So that question, I think, or that description of what Syria is right on. The second question is a little bit more difficult to answer because I thought this process that I was entering, and I was entering it to talk about a specific alleged use of chemical weapons by Bashar al-Assad in Syria or his forces, his government-led forces in Duma, was specious. And the OPCW inspectors who more or less revolted, became whistleblowers themselves, and said it was suspect, were not listened to and were even punished within the OPCW. Now, the OPCW is a special group, unlike the IAEA and some other UN-sponsored groups of that nature. They've never been too influenced by the United States. They have been. You can't help but be influenced by the empire. But they have been more or less on the even keel most of the time. They didn't take political positions. They just reported the facts. I think this was a particularly egregious violation of that kind of protocol, and so I testified. What I found out was this process that they have set up to do this sort of thing offline, as it were. That is to say, not do it in the UN Security Council, but do it in this new format so that politics doesn't dominate everything, was farcical. If you watched it, and I think you still can watch it on YouTube even, it was farcical. It was a standard deal. Everybody from England to Russia to China made their standard talking points. And my testimony and Hans's testimony and Aaron Mate's testimony, which was quite good and detailed, was lost in the cacophony of the politics of the UN Security Council. Some of the foreign ministers or their representatives actually talked about other things than what we were talking about. Typical UN palaver, especially at that level in the UN Security Council. So it was a disappointment to me. But I did it because, as I said to the people convening it, the Russians, my purpose was not to criticize any particular state. My purpose was to say the OPCW is a good organization, a necessary organization. They destroyed 600 metric tons of chemicals out in the Mediterranean using basically the US Army that belonged to Syria, one of the largest stocks of chemical weapons in the world. Let's not pollute them. Let's not corrupt them. That was my point.
Yes, and we're very concerned with that scandal, as you said. Members of the OPCW revolting and becoming whistleblowers, that only weakens arms control, exactly. and it's a real shame. And as you said, Aaron Mate has done great work in exposing that, and I watched and appreciated your testimony as well, Colonel Wilkerson. So I thank you for that. I do want to move into U.S.-China relations. This is something that is increasingly become a major concern for the peace movement here in Massachusetts and more broadly, that this specter of China as the next major enemy of the United States is, well, it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's also driving something that we constantly fight against, which is increasing our massive national security budget, which now represents well over $1 trillion. As you characterize it, and I think you characterize it correctly. Can I get a general comment on how you see U.S.-China relations right now?
Certainly. And let me give you just a little bit of history. My first trip to China as a diplomat was with Richard Haass, director of the policy planning staff, in the summer of 2001. Our interlocutors were Wang Yi and Shui Tenkai. Wang Yi, of course, is the plenipotentiary, the almost Qin Shi Qian-like foreign minister between the Politburo and the MOFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs now, very powerful, very eloquent speaker, the equivalent almost, not quite, but almost of Sergei Lavrov in Moscow as a diplomat. Shui, of course, was ambassador to the United States. That was a most impressive policy planning set of talks. We understood almost immediately, and the Chinese appreciated our understanding, that they wanted help. We even got words out of Wang Yi, for example, like the following in English. We really don't mind the US 7th Fleet in the Pacific because it keeps things stable and we're able to promote what we really want to promote, our economy, within that stability. We won't say that publicly, of course, any more than you will say publicly that the Catholic Church should come into China and the Pope will be with them or whatever, because at that point, China had a real objection to the Catholic Church being in China because they thought the Pope would run everything, which is really not all that strange. I go back to the election of John Kennedy, and I remember a lot of Americans saying the same thing if Kennedy became president. Move forward to the next set of policy planning talks when they came to Washington, same interlocutors, and we had them in Washington about a year later. Then move forward to the 2009 petroleum disruption exercise that I ran under Deloitte Touche, Microsoft, and the Strategic Party School in China, in Beijing, in the financial district, in the new Ritz-Carlton there. All of this to tell you that I saw a China that was very Sun Tzuian. They wanted to pursue their interest in peace. They did not want war. They wanted to pursue their interest in strategic competition with the greatest economic power in the world. You could say that certainly after the 19th Party Congress, even Xi Jinping wanted to surpass that power. And incidentally, they will. They already have in purchasing power parity. So the real measure of anybody's economic might. So it's just a matter of a few years before they will, on the chalkboard, they'll be the #1 economy in the world, unless something drastic happens, always a possibility. But everything for them was strategic competition, which they thought they had every right to be in, and we had every right to be in, and may the best man win, the best state win in this case. That was their approach. And that's why we came up with a continuation of the previous administration and the previous administration of that's policy of strategic competition. And we helped them as much as we could to be on a level playing field, like bringing them into the World Trade Organization and so forth. Now that's all being repudiated. Big mistake, huge mistake. We are creating our own worst nightmare. We're forcing China to deal with us as if we were a traditional status quo great power, slipping from the top of the hill. No question we are slipping. And that eventually, and because of that slippage, we'll blame somebody and go to war with them. This is a very dangerous thing to do. History screams at us that it is, from Thucydides to the British Empire. And I don't know why we're doing it, and I welcome the people. I do know why we're doing it. It increases the military budget. That's one reason. Second, it gives Lockheed Martin and others every hope that they'll continue to sell all these merchants of death weapons. That's why we're doing it. And we need an enemy. We got to have an enemy. We simply have to have an enemy. That is so requisite in imperial rule that it just screams at you out of all the history books. We have to have an enemy. We have to have an enemy. And this time we might want two. Maybe we'll throw Russia in too and accuse them of forming an alliance so we can really have a formidable enemy. Now, I'll call your attention to an article by a fellow by the name of Mike Sweeney. This is a scenario that scares me greatly. If we went to war with Russia, let's say, on the Ukraine border in any fashion, conventional or otherwise, we'd lose. We'd lose the opening battle, and we'd lose it in such a stark way. We'd have 10,000 dead Americans and dead Norwegians and others in a matter of 48 hours. That's what real war is. We haven't been in a real war for a long, long, long time. And by the way, we haven't won a war in a long, long time. Same thing with Taiwan. We would lose the opening battle. We would lose it badly. We'd lose an aircraft carrier or two. That's 5,000, 10,000 souls dead instantly. What would we do, Mike asks? Would we sit back and say we're the stronger economy ultimately if we get our act together? We're the stronger governmental system if we get our act together. We're the stronger culture if we get our act together. Let's just keep going. We'll win this struggle eventually. No, Mike says, we'll go nuclear. That's very scary.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and that speaks to some of Dan Ellsberg's work from the Doomsday Machine. That was certainly the plan, the PSYOP plan back in the 1960s. If any divisional forces between Russia and the United States went to war, the plan was to go nuclear, not just against Russia, but against China as well. They didn't have a plan to do something limited. It was all-out nuclear war, and that's what concerns us greatly. As you said, history is screaming out to us not to go down this path. It doesn't end well. But I'd like to get your comment a little bit on the domestic political situation here in the United States, in Washington, D.C. At the beginning of this month, the U.S. Senate passed a bill that was characterized as anti-China, bolstering competitiveness with China. And very strangely these days, that passed with bipartisan support in the U.S. Senate. I believe it was 68 to 32, the final vote, with every Democrat, not counting Bernie Sanders, voting for that bill. And there's a specter of another anti-China bill being led by Senator Menendez that you mentioned that is right on the horizon. So could you comment on those pieces of legislation, and why is anti-China one of the few things that the Republicans and Democrats can get together on?
You just characterized briefly a phenomenon that I'm seriously worried about, and that is that we've become so polarized in our domestic politics that we reach out and yearn for such issues. If you'll recall, Franklin Roosevelt, even as Hitler rolled over Europe like a juggernaut, couldn't get Americans interested in the European war. It took an attack on Pearl Harbor and a huge strategic error by Adolf Hitler declaring war on the United States in order to get the American people enthused, if you will, about going to war with Hitler. Today, it's a very different phenomenon. We've been at war now for 20 years, but most Americans haven't a clue because they have no skin in the game, none whatsoever. Less than 1% of America has served in the armed forces in the last 20 years. So this is a very dangerous time, and it's a dangerous time for the reasons I pointed out, plus what I've intimated, and that is that you grasp at things that unify people. And one way you can unify Americans, as we saw vividly after 9/11, is to bloody them or tell them they might be bloodied, tell them that they might be overcome, they might be overthrown, their whole government and everything else. So you get the Putin, Xi Jinping, perfect people out there to fulfill this manifesto and to make sure that you can do this. And you never think, and this is so typically American in our imperial age that it hurts, you never think that you might be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy and that you might not come out the other end. You might indeed be forecasting your own demise. And yet, if you look at the history of empire, that's precisely what empires do. Since time, 5,000 years, that's what empires do. Now, some of them find off-ramps, like Britain did, for example, after 56, and they become a middling power rather than an empire. France, to a certain extent, too, although there are vestiges in Cote d'Ivoire and Mali and so forth of France's empire still, and still haunting the world and haunting the people in those countries, too. But it's so typical that you just sit back and scratch your head. And if you're an academic and looking at it from an academic point of view, you want to laugh, but you can't laugh because the results are so heinous and so disastrous, so catastrophic. Laughter is not the right recipe.
Yeah, well, it's the problem of hubris, as you mentioned, which goes back to the ancient Greeks.
I was telling my daughter about 2 days ago, I guess, we'd come back from a little vacation when I took all my grandkids, about Thucydides and about his sort of application of that term to the Athenians, of course. And most people, they've heard of Thucydides, but they don't really know that he was a general. And he actually fought in some of the campaigns. This is a man who knew what he was talking about. And there are a lot of things that he wrote in his history that apply to today. They're lessons for today.
Yeah, and I have to say that I was extremely concerned and have been throughout the Biden administration. I think it was sort of a sub-theme of this trip to Europe, as you mentioned, trying to get the European allies and NATO to buy into domination of the Indo-Pacific region, an anti-China strategy, and even his State of the Union, it wasn't a joint address to Congress, I believe. Right. It seemed to be a sub theme of that speech was we need to build back better so we can beat China in the 21st century.
And I really think we believe that in our heart of hearts, we need a massive threat to unify the American people, or even to get a significant minority or even a small majority of them on our side politically. And we don't think about what we're doing. Now, there's some of us who think about what we're doing and want it. You'd be amazed at how many people I met when I was Powell's chief of staff who would look at me and say things like, well, it's time we kill some people. It's time we got rid of this surplus population in the world. It's time we found some way to get rid of 2 or 3 billion people. There are people who believe that. There are people in the United States who believe that. There are people in the United States who are working for that. There are people who have billions of dollars who are working for that.
That's chilling to hear, but I think it's a reality that we need to face. I just want to ask one more question. I've already talked for too long before we turn it over to the audience. And that was a video that really has been making the rounds quite a bit. And this took place at a press conference after the meeting between Biden and Putin. And President Biden was giving a speech, and he was talking about Russia and their interference in foreign elections. And without a hint of irony, he said to the assembled journalists, how would it be if the United States was actively interfering in the elections of other countries? And he described that as the actions of a dying state trying to cling to great power status. I was shocked that someone with so much foreign policy experience as President Joe Biden could say something like that. And I'm interested in your reaction to it.
You know, I made this comment on a Bill Maher show maybe 4 years ago or so, when Bill asked me, did I know Joe Biden? And I said, well, I know Joe Biden somewhat, but I know him well through Colin Powell because they worked together for a long time. Colin Powell would call Joe Biden rather than Dick Lugar, who was then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Biden was the minority member at that time, because Biden knew the issues better than Lugar. Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, actually got mad at Powell for doing that. Why don't you go to Dick? Why don't you go to Dick? Why are you going to Joe? He's a Democrat. Powell said, I'm going to the man that knows the issues, damn it. But Joe had a tendency to let his, as we used to say in the military, rear end overload his mouth sometimes. And he had a loquacity that as a congressman was not necessarily damaging, although a couple of times it did do some damage to him. But as president, ooh, bad deal. Somebody shut him up, whatever. I've been worried about that ever since he took the oath. And I think maybe we saw a little bit of that. And yet, at the same time, I know how the Democrats struggle today, the Democrats as a body struggle today with bona fides in the national security issue, with the American people think is important. And so they have to say things. Why hasn't he, for example, told Secretary Blinken to get finished with this review on Cuba policy and return to what the policy was under President Obama, and then improved it from there? I think it's all about these bona fides in national security, and they don't feel like they can surrender them. They need to start thinking beyond that. They need to think strategically. They need to think about what they're doing and what they're creating out there. And I don't think they're doing that. The Quincy Institute, of which I'm a senior fellow, had an hour-long conference today. And one of the things everyone agreed on was the United States civilian government, not the military, unfortunately, does strategy almost not at all. It does its inbox. It does tomorrow morning. It does not think strategically. By the way, I think that's probably the worst deficit we have vis-a-vis China, because they do think strategically. But we need to start thinking strategically. What is it we're creating? And is what we're creating worse than what we're trying to take out politically or otherwise in the short term? Because the long term is going to be hideous.
Thanks, Colonel Wilkerson. Now we're going to go to the lightning round, rapid fire questions. I hope that people can be brief in asking their questions, but I hope you can stay with us, Colonel Wilkerson, and we're willing to go as long as you are. First on the board, I see Michael Passerini. Mike, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. And go ahead with your question for Colonel Wilkerson. And please, everyone, just keep your questions brief so we can get to as many as possible.
Hi, Mr. Wilkerson. Regarding what you said about bringing China and essentially all the nuclear powers into the disarmament process, I just think back to the Trump administration, when that administration put forward some maybe superficially similar plans, saying we want to bring in China, we want to bring in these other nuclear powers, and that was largely dismissed by the arms control community as something that was purposefully a non-starter. So do you see the same issue presenting itself in even a good faith effort? And then my second question was regarding just diplomacy with China. I think it's the COVID-19 pandemic has made it very clear that, you know, the United States and most countries really need to restore their own supply chains. And obviously that's going to have quite a serious effect on our relationship with China. So I wondered if you had any comments on that too. Thank you.
Good questions. You always have bureaucratic opposition to anything that threatens to change or break their rice bowls. And I think that's what you're seeing here. But you already have the groundwork for this. You have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that treaty, to which most of the world is signatory, you have some people who have reneged, like North Korea, and you have people like Israel, who should be, again, arm bent until they sign. That treaty essentially says we're working towards zero nuclear weapons. That's what the purpose of the treaty is. We have made remarkable progress on that since the end of the Cold War. We had something like 30,000 nuclear warheads each, and a requisite number of launchers and other things, paraphernalia that go with it. We're down considerably from that, even at roughly 4,000 to 5,000 on both the Russians and our side, and much less than that on the Chinese side, around 300, 400 on the Chinese side, and Pakistan and India similarly. Israel may be the highest I've heard is 200. So that's the process. All you do is resurrect that treaty and enforce it and go after it and be sincere about it. The 5 original nuclear powers have never been sincere about it, but they'll never be unless America is. And I agree with Colin Powell. I don't think you're ever going to get to zero, because once the genie's out of the bottle and it's out, you can't disinvent, to use Disraeli's good English word, I think he invented it, nuclear weapons. You simply can't. So, you know, a few. I'll let you in on a little secret. We did a study in the Joint Staff, and we said we could deter anybody in the world if we could build this process out with 300 to 600. Wow. Wouldn't that be wonderful if that were all we had? And they'd be mostly on submarines, maybe a few for planes. And could you go down to zero from there? Maybe you could if something else rolls along, and I don't discount that at all. We may find some weapons in the future that make nuclear weapons look puny. I hope not, but we may. And I hope that's not the way we go to zero. As far as diplomacy with China goes, I think the key here is returning to that formulation, that strategic formulation. And Chaz Freeman has said this so many ways. Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who was Nixon's translator, when he met with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong and affected the rapprochement with China, and was ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Chaz is another person who, when he dies, there'll be a warp in the fabric of knowledge in the world. He was with me in Beijing for the petroleum disruption exercise, speaks fluent Mandarin, didn't tell the Chinese he did. That was interesting. We got a good report every night on what they'd actually said. And you have to go back to that kind of formulation, and you have to say there's room in the world for both of us. Now let's look at some realities, which Chaz likes to point out. One, the Chinese have replaced us in Northeast Asia and in East Asia in general. They have. I'm sorry. We can sail all the freedom of navigation operations through there we want. They are the hegemon, if you will, in that area. We need to come to a modus vivendi with them with regard to the South China Sea, eventually Taiwan, and so forth. They are also, as I said before, going to replace us as the #1 economic power in the world, but we won't be far behind. What do we do with that? Well, I'm not saying we would then diplomatically compose a condominium where we would run the world together, but I'm saying we'd do something like that, and we do it for the benefit of all mankind. We keep denigrating the base road initiative, maritime leg, the polar leg now with the Arctic, and the Chinese are 900 nautical miles away from the Arctic at their closest point, but they have a polar Silk Road now. The one that is most important through Central Asia and so forth, that could bring a lot of people out of poverty. It could bring a lot of people into a more peaceful, prosperous, stable situation than they are in now. Let's help them. We don't have the money they do to do that, but let's help them in other ways. Let's help them with countries like Iran, for example. Let's help them with countries like Venezuela, for example. Venezuela is just falling apart right now, and it's causing Colombia to begin to fall apart too. Not to mention Plan Colombia and what we did to Colombia with our great drug policy. The world needs a different approach. And the two most powerful economic entities in the world, China and the United States, need to work together, not at cross purposes. That's the truth. That's the reality. Climate change will corroborate it and prove it, and we'll either all die or we'll survive.
Thanks. I'm going to keep moving right along, and I'm going to take a question from the chat. This is from Colette. Colonel Wilkerson, any thoughts on how our policy toward Israel does or does not benefit the United States?
Colette, another great question. Israel is probably a strategic liability of the first order for the United States. I'm hoping that getting rid of Netanyahu and at the same time getting rid of Kushner and Pompeo and Trump will alleviate the situation to the extent that we'll get a government in Israel, maybe, that will see how dangerous its future. I said the other day, Israel will not be a state in 20 years. It'll be gone. It certainly will not be a democracy. It'll be an apartheid state, and the world will just reject it, as they did South Africa. But I'm now saying it probably won't be a state. It'll be gone. Go back and read the report of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when Truman was trying to decide whether or not to recognize Israel in 1947-48. and what to do about U.S. policy. Completely no came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, based on the fact there were 400 some odd million Arabs and about at that time 3, maybe 4 million Israelis, and other things too. And God, how prescient that report was. Well, it's come true. They are a strategic liability now. The only strategic positive with regard to Israel is our relationship. That is to say, there are a lot of American Jews and there are a lot of connections with Israel. That's the only positive aspect to our relationship. Everything else is negative. And if you want to go the full Monty, you could say Israel is the most likely state in the world to take the United States to Armageddon. And I could paint you all sorts of ways we would do that and the ways we would get there. One would be the fact that for 40 plus years, the military said, don't ever tell us to put a base in Israel. Don't ever tell us that. We will not comply. Well, we just put a base in Israel. There's a base in Israel flying the stars and stripes now. In for a penny, in for a pound. Hezbollah shoots a rocket, hits that base. Guess what? The United States is with Israel when it goes to war with all of those Arabs and maybe half the world combined. Not a good deal. Not a good deal. So yes, Israel, I think, needs to be reined in, and it needs to be told in no uncertain terms, you will change, and you will change swiftly and effectively, or you can count your sugar daddy gone.
Yeah,
Not going to happen. Not going to happen.
Yeah, but we do have that leverage if we were willing to use it, but it takes political courage to do so.
After the first Gulf War, I watched H.W. Bush and Jim Baker use the leverage gained in that war. You know, we restrained Israel. We put people over there and said, you will not respond to that Scud missile that just hit outside Tel Aviv that Saddam Hussein shot at them. Because we knew the whole coalition would fall apart if Israel joined the war. That's how they are a strategic liability, big time. If we're not willing to use the leverage that we have, like H.W. Bush did at that time, to bring about Oslo, this relationship is going nowhere but downhill.
Thanks. I'm going to keep it moving right along. Next question, Eli Schatz. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and put you up on the screen for your question for Colonel Wilkerson.
Yeah, you started early in your comments about saying how absurd our policy toward Cuba was. And I wonder if thinking of it as absurd actually is not helpful, because from my point of view, our policy toward Cuba basically has to do with the fact that we don't want any other possible way in the world to be recognized. Our way is the only way. And this is one of the reasons we have problems with Venezuela and Iran. Any other country that wants to go its own way winds up in our gun sights, and so in the gun sights of the United States. I don't like to say our, but my question is, if we were good as peace activists at a level which don't have power, but are trying to address the American people, what is the point that we should mostly be focusing on? Is it the idea that we do not want the United States to be a hegemon, that we want a multipolar world? Is that a, I'm concerned about from if you have any insight into what could be the critical point that we as citizens press, in relationship to a government which, currently is our government.
That's a very serious question. And I've given this much thought. In Havana, in Santiago, and other places, with Cuban interlocutors and with Americans visiting with me and others. I'll start there and just say that Cuba's a special case. The real hangover for the United States is they threw our dictator, Fulgencio Batista, out. They confiscated our property, really Cuban property, and they had the colossal gall to allow the Russians to put missiles that threaten the United States directly from Cuba. And it's a special case. It's a special case which we don't even remember those things now, most of us, but we're willing to resurrect them and to pull them out in National Security Council meetings and say, see, these people should never be forgiven. Never, never, never forgiven. And I've seen that happen. Move on to the next issue. What's the next issue on the agenda? You're not going to talk about that. So Cuba is a special case, and it's a case that just teaches you about the quality of leadership, particularly since Eisenhower, that we've had in the United States. Deteriorating, I would argue, almost every term after Eisenhower in some way or another. A lot of the times because of inexperience. I mean, you can't find an Eisenhower, you can't find a George Washington every day. So experience, my students will tell you the number one requirement for a president is experience, and the number one deficit for most presidents in the post-World War II era is lack of experience. So when you come to questions like you just made, I think it's very, and recognize that we're a democratic federal republic, or a federal republic with democratic tendencies. It's very difficult to make policy. It's very difficult to change things. It's very difficult to say, I am going to have, as we did on the Quincy Institute conference call today, a more powerful State Department than I have a military department. Very hard to say, because $715 billion is going to the one and less than 100 to the other, because there are military officers all over the world who are bigger diplomats, more powerful diplomats than anybody at the State Department. When the combatant commander in Honolulu goes to Tokyo, he carries everything with him: fighter and bomber wings, carrier battle groups, Marine amphibious ready groups, you name it. He is given office and counsel by the head of Japan's government. When the Undersecretary of State or the Assistant Secretary of State goes, he's not even recognized. He's lucky if he can get a call. That's the reality of America today. If we don't change that, if we don't shift, as we talked about today at Quincy, if we don't shift that, we're in trouble. And we're gonna finish up. We're gonna finish up, and we're gonna finish up in a blaze. We're not gonna find an off-ramp and so forth. Got a suggestion when I was Chief of Staff of the Air Force, which sounds crazy, but it addresses exactly what I'm talking about for the whole nation and the whole use of power in the world. This suggestion came from a lieutenant colonel at the Naval War College in a paper she had written, and we passed around the State Department. She proposed, and it's a lot more intricate than I'm going to say here, but this is the basic nature of it, that instead of having 4-star admirals and generals in all these places, we have undersecretaries of state. We get them out of Washington. We make them work foreign policy, not domestic policy. They live in Honolulu. They live in Stuttgart. Their deputy is the 4-star general, heretofore been the king in that region. So you have a civilian on top and a military 4-star underneath him. Were there to be a global conflict or a regional conflict in that area, the situation would reverse. The civilian would become the military officer's deputy, and the military officer would be in charge until it was over, and then the civilian would take over again. That's the kind of dramatic change you would have to make in the way we address power and its use in the world in order to get the kind of change I think I'm talking about. And that is to bring about a world that does more talking than fighting, and that talk is productive. Is that so hard to imagine? Yes, in our country, because we have become a warfare state.
Yeah, and you just answered, Colonel Wilkerson, the next question that I was going to ask you, which is a great one from the chat. I just want to credit James. And he asked, have we become so enamored in this country with our military power that we're no longer able to realize the value of diplomacy? And I think that's a
That's
major crisis that we need to resolve.
That's an excellent question. And we didn't resolve even the way we're going to approach it at Quincy. And we're going to have a lot more meetings about how we're going to write about it, talk about it, and so forth. Let me give you another indicator. I belong to the Eisenhower Media Network. This is people like Eric Edstrom, if you've read his book, Danny Surgeon, if you've read any of his books.
We know it well. Eric Edstrom's a member of Massachusetts Peace Action. We know and love him.
The Brown Institute, for example, the Sarah Sewell and the group up there, the Cost of War Project, they just reduce. I sent it around to everybody I know today. They just produced a document that says how many suicides we have in the military. It's outpacing anything like what we have in the civilian world, and it's abominable in the civilian world. And one of the reasons we talked about this, military veterans talked about this. One of the reasons is because we're asking them to kill people for Lockheed Martin. They kill babies and women and children. They destroy homes. They displace families, all for God and country. Hell no, it's not for God and country unless they're working for Mephistopheles. It's for Lockheed Martin. It's for Raytheon. It's for Boeing. It's for the 0.001% of the people in this country that own 60% of the wealth, the GDP of Brazil. It's for all of these other special interests. It isn't for flag, God, and country or anything even remotely resembling it. That caused me to do suicide too, I think, if I'd done some of the things that these men and women tell me they've done in the name of America.
Thank you, Colonel Wilkerson. Next question is going to be from Michael Hoey. Michael, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and you're up for your question for Colonel Wilkerson.
Okay, I just unmuted. I have a question that may be two times on the same fork. So it's ways that we go to other countries into responding to our aggressive behavior. So the first is just a second. Start my video. The first is a Newsweek article from a month ago, and it's talking about a secret undercover army, about 6,000 people. It's something called signature reduction. And so that's the first thing. It kind of seems like a new stay behind network. It's talking about guys in NSA and special ops and all these different organizations that are using the division of the Pentagon to reduce their footprint, either their physical or online presence. So it's a program that's been referred to as signature reduction. And my second question, it may be the same kind of thing, but it concerns the National Endowment for Democracy. And apparently part of their operations are dedicated to permanent regime change or preparing people to have their countries overthrown, if I understand it correctly. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to wrap my head around is if we're constantly goading people into doing stuff so that we can get greater market share, where does it all take us? I mean, if we have all these people that are assuming false identities to go in computer networks and pretend they're someone they're not so that they can get someone to do something they shouldn't do. And we have the National Endowment for Democracy that in the name of promoting democracy is writing reports attacking China and Russia about using sharp power as opposed to our soft power, stuff like this. I'm just wondering where that all will lead and how that plays into our whole military industrial framework.
Thanks, Michael.
I think those are good questions too. They highlight something that I saw when I was in the State Department and I think has only amplified since. And that is that the CIA has become very sophisticated and other elements of government, but the CIA is usually the lead in using non-governmental organizations, quasi organizations, quahogs we call them, and other similar entities instead of using their own troops, as it were. They use the NED, they use the IRI, they use all kinds of, even Les Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders. They infiltrate them and they use them. Now they've done this ever since Bill Donovan and Alan Dulles invented the concept, World War II and afterwards. But now they're doing it in a very sophisticated way, and they're using national technical means to help them, and the social media and so forth. Let me reverse gears here and tell you something that I just found out that I'm quite sure is accurate. You know that Donald Trump canceled the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Well, those of us who knew something about Dominion Virginia Power, my utility, for example, in Virginia, and the second largest utility, only exceeded by Duke Power on the Eastern Seaboard, lost a $12 billion investment in the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Well, how did they lose that? Under Donald Trump, how did they lose that? Well, it's increasingly clear that the GRU, which is the military intelligence unit that Putin controls in Moscow, the GRU so infected Virginia politics and so infected national politics and ultimately got their man in the White House, I think, to orchestrate its cancellation. Now, what did that do? Not only did it hurt Dominion to the point that they lost that $12+ billion investment and had to cut their dividend rate, and their stocks dropped a little and so forth. They had to retrench. They had to bring a lot of their tentacles in and so forth. Maybe not all that bad for a public utility, but let's look at this further. What would that have done to the Russian capacity to control Germany, and through Germany, much of the rest of Europe, because of their energy dependence on Gazprom? What would it have done to Nord Stream 2, for example, the latest effort to hook Germany? Well, it would have competed with it. It would have probably given the Europeans an alternative to just Russian energy. This is what's going on in the world now. And anybody that doubts it is crazy. It is going on. All this to say that some of the things you're reporting, like signature reduction and so forth, are potentially positives in this struggle, because that is what it is. It's a struggle. My view is we won't fight any wars with tanks and battleships and so forth anymore, despite what Mike Sweeney said. Now, we may get into a conventional struggle, the way Mike pointed out in that article, over Taiwan or whatever. But I think the future for great powers or near great powers is taking down each other's systems. You're going to take down the distribution system for food, the distribution system for energy. They're going to take down, for us, our financial system. Imagine the havoc that would wreak. You put a country like us or like China or Russia on its knees almost instantly. So some of this is positive in the sense that it's dealing with a negative that might be traumatic and even existential in terms of our society, our economy, and so forth. At the same time, and you have to maintain this balance inside government. It's one of the most difficult things you do on a daily basis. I see the NSA and others going well beyond what they were authorized to do by the Patriot Act and post 9/11 in general, and essentially spying on us all and collecting data on us all. And it's not just metadata, it's everything. If their financial activities unit at NSA wants to take your bank account out and everything you own and everything you stand for financially, they could do it in a nanosecond and you wouldn't even know it was done. You'd be broke, busted, bankrupt, whatever you want to call it, and you wouldn't know it was done. You might not even have an identity left. You might have difficulty proving who you are, that you have a social security number, a passport, or whatever. Not might, you would have. I watched us do some of this to the North Koreans. I watched us do some of this to others in the world too. It's very, very difficult to be pleased with these developments in any way. But you do, I think, until we reintroduce diplomacy and maybe work out some deals on these things, you do have to be cognizant that they're going to do them to you. And you do have to develop means to combat it.
Thanks. My next question also comes from the chat. I promise I'm going to let you go soon, Colonel Wilkerson. but I know you've had a lot to say on this subject, and that's the subject of economic sanctions as warfare. We have heard that there are going to be efforts coming from Capitol Hill to try and reform, a much needed reform of the president's emergency powers of the NEA from 1976. Do you think it's possible? Do you think it's necessary for sanctions reform to be a part of that with the increasing use of economic sanctions, especially by the last administration?
Next to returning to the Constitution in terms of the war power, it is essential. I mean, I'd say that one was the first one. Let's get the Congress into making decisions about whether the executive can go to war or not first. But I'd almost say it's collateral. You need to also revise this sanctions business, and you need to take a look at OFAC, the Office of Financial Assets Control, which is basically the enforcement mechanism for sanctions. And you need to ask some fundamental questions, like Charles de Gaulle was right when he said the power of the dollar was the most insidious weapon America wielded. He had every reason to say that too at the time. We have to get a handle on all the things it would be a three-phase process, I think. We tried to do some of this. We failed. You first have to get a handle on the sanctions in force this minute. That's like trying to audit the Defense Department, because we have sanctioned half the world, either individuals or states or both in most cases. Unwinding that is as difficult as auditing the Defense Department, which has not been done successfully, though Congress has ordered it now for almost 20 years. And of course, it's a necessity anyway under the law, but they've never been able to do it. The second thing you need to do, once you've identified all the sanctions, is probably eliminate about 90% of them. They are, in effect, hurting the very people we wish to empower in most states, not the people we wish out of power. That's the simple logic of it. It's almost too stupid to talk about in that sense. Let me give you one example. In Iran, the sanctions that were made even more draconian by Pompeo and Kushner and Trump actually probably produced some COVID deaths that shouldn't have happened. And you had remarks in the NSC like the following one: starve them to death, and then they'll overthrow their government. That is a violation of the laws of war, of international law. You're not supposed to use food as a weapon. We were the leader. We were the state leader in bringing that rule, that law about. And yet now we're violating it every other day. We're doing the same thing in Venezuela. We're killing people with our sanctions, but we don't care. At least that's what the transcripts of NSC conversations seem to say. I'm encouraged by the fact that Blinken, Sullivan, and Biden do seem to care, and they want to see what they can do about it, but it is going to be a huge challenge. And the third reason it's going to be a huge challenge is there are people left, yes, by Dick Cheney and by other presidents in positions of authority in the sanctions enforcement business, who, even if the president were to issue an executive order, or even better, the Congress passed a law that said stop, would not stop. That's how bad it is. That's how laborious the process will be. That's how labyrinthine is our sanctions regime. It's as bad as the Defense Department, and that is bad.
Well, thank you for laying out just how serious the problem is, and the need for us to get active around turning back this economic warfare that is hurting millions of people, billions of people across the world. Next, I want to turn it over to Mary Ansari, who has a question regarding the first thing you talked about, Cuba. Mary, are you with us? Okay, I'll put you on hold, Mary.
I'm
Okay,
unmuted. I'm
Go
with
ahead,
you.
Mary.
So Colonel Wilkerson, I appreciate the work you've done since leaving the State Department. I really do. You've been a great voice. Nevertheless, you were aide to Secretary Powell when the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba report was written in 2004 under President Bush. It apparently continues to be the blueprint for US action even through to today, never renounced by President Obama, let alone anybody else. As I read it, it's a basic blueprint for undermining and overthrowing the Cuban government through soft and hard subversion. And I've provided a link to it in the chat, though you can read the executive summary. No need to read all 400 pages. I don't know how you did it. But so hard and soft subversion, especially via and using young people, academics, and religious institutions, with a clear goal of molding Cuba to our idea of what it should be. Number one, could you comment on how you saw this report at the time and how you feel it has stood the test of time in our relation and failure of relations with Cuba? Two, do you think that the Biden administration, as I'm coming to suspect, is in fact convinced that they can wait out the Cuban government and people to the point that life becomes so untenable that the country collapses or at least turns to us for solutions? If not, how do you explain the fact that the Biden administration will not take even the simplest of executive order measures to ease Cuban suffering from the twin devastating whammies of COVID and the US embargo? And three, as though I have not thrown enough at you, how do you think the US will vote tomorrow in the United Nations on the US embargo? Will they do an Obama and abstain by any chance? Or will they do their usual and vote against ending the embargo, that is?
Those are all three questions that have been on my mind since 2009, certainly. That and calling them a state sponsor of terrorism and so forth. Cuba hadn't got a sponsorship for a single terrorist in the world that I know of. Let's start with the last one. I hope that tomorrow when the vote is cast, I hope we would vote with the rest of the world, because that's the way the rest of the world, we would condemn our own blockade. We won't. So I hope we abstain as we did under President Obama. And Samantha Power, as much as sometimes Samantha really irritated me, gave a most beautiful speech as an accompaniment to that vote. And those who don't know what we're talking about, they're voting, and the world will vote to condemn our blockade on Cuba, our embargo on Cuba. And we abstain for the first time. It's kind of like when we vote with, I don't remember how many it is now, but so many votes we voted against the rest of the world with regard to Israel and its treatment of the Palestinians and so forth. So that answers that part, at least from my point of view. The report, like so many reports, I'm sitting there as chief of staff and I see this report that comes across my desk and tells me whom we are declaring as state sponsors of terror or terrorism. And I say, why are we putting this country there? Well, because we really don't like that country today. Well, this country doesn't support terrorism. I don't have any proof. INR, Intelligence Bureau at the State Department. Does this country support terrorism? We don't have any hard evidence on that. Why are we putting them there? Well, the White House told us to. All this to say that you do some things that you have to do to survive politically, and then your instructions go out to not implement what you did to survive politically. Happens all the time in government. It particularly happens with regard to the State Department. It happens the other way too, where you implement it more in a more draconian fashion than even its inventors intended. What I found out when I was in Cuba, all over the country, and then with the Cuban government, including Ricardo Alarcón, who was president of their National Assembly and loved to drink scotch and got me good rum to drink. And we would go to 2 o'clock in the morning and yak at each other in Spanish and English. what I learned was that the Cubans were well aware of all of this stuff, and they knew exactly what it was. Basically, it was a jobs program for those Cuban Americans, fundamentally in Florida, but also in New Jersey, Las Vegas, and elsewhere, who were on the payroll of the State Department for all this money that was supposed to go to covert operations and other things in Cuba. I even had the head of the Martin Luther King Center down there laugh at me with regard to our ability to influence their religious thought in Cuba because it wasn't working. So I laugh and I joke about this, but this is a way your government works often. You pass these things because Roger Noriega or Otto Reich or John Bolton or somebody got in there and got the president to do it. And then you tell your people down at where the rubber meets the road, don't execute this, don't do it. Or you understand that in this case, most of the money, sometimes millions of dollars, and it never got any higher than millions, thank God, is going to support Cuban Americans in Florida who will vote for you because you're giving them a job. And no one ever sets foot on Cuban territory, or if they do, they're so ineffectual, they get captured and put in jail in Cuba or here in this country, like Alan Groves. That's not to say that the report and everything it represented wasn't a bit nefarious and wasn't recognized as such, but it's to say that this policy, even the enforcement of the blockade, is an afterthought. Even with a hardcore Republican government like George W. Bush's, where they were basically paying the Cuban Americans in Florida who gave him the Supreme Court decision that made him president back by what they did. President Obama was not that far away from that sort of thing, but he did entertain a policy that eventually affected a somewhat closer relationship because he found Raul Castro manageable and dealable with. And I think he was personally inclined. When I met with him in the White House Roosevelt Room in November of 2015, and we had a chance to talk, John Kerry was with him. I got the impression that he really wanted to do that and that he thought our policy, I think he used this term even, was absurd. Colin Powell used to say that all the time. Powell would look at me and he would say, you know, if we opened up to Cuba, they would change in a nanosecond. If we opened up to North Korea, they would change in a nanosecond. And I would say, well, I don't think it's quite that simple, boss. There's a lot in North Korea that wouldn't change. It would take time. And there's some things in Cuba that wouldn't change. It would take time. But I am now amended in my views with regard to Cuba because I saw it changing massively. I saw the market forces taking over. I saw entrepreneurs. Cubans are the best entrepreneurs in Latin America. They're just straining. They want to be auto mechanics. They want to be auto salesmen of better cars. They want to run restaurants that are world class. They want to run hotels that are world class, golf courses and so forth. Now, all of that is, in my view, and somewhat corruptive because it's predatory crony capitalism that they want to do, not unlike China does, not unlike we do, not unlike Israel does. But it's better than what they got, and it'll produce more product and more success and more prosperity for their people. But I'd hate to see them lose to things like 100% literacy, like 16-year-old women who are beautiful, who stand in the street and hitchhike with a man they've never met in their life and have no fear whatsoever. Crime of the kind of nature we have in this country is almost non-existent in Cuba. They have universal health care, and it's pretty good health care. I would have let my wife get her cataracts removed in a Havana clinic in a heartbeat. They don't want to lose the things that they've gained, but they do want to gain better prosperity, better economic success, and more freedom to travel and everything else. And they were getting that under President Obama. Trump shut the door on it. When I was last in Havana, a wonderful woman at Menrex, Josefina Vidal, put me in a car and drove me an hour out to a protocol house outside Havana. And in the process of that trip, she asked me fundamental questions. what will happen to Cuba when Trump is president? And I said, there are three possibilities. One, he's ignorant. He doesn't know anything about Cuba. So he'll frankly ignore you, and you can prosper under that ignoring. Two, he will find you, realize you're vulnerable, and go whole hog to make your life even more miserable than it already is. Or three, he will not know anything about you, won't care about you, won't ever focus on you at all. And people who know that within his administration, who are hardcore right wingers, will attack you relentlessly for however long he's in office. The ambassador told me, your third thing is what has happened. This is when I met with her yesterday. I think she's right. These neoconservatives and others who got into the administration, good old Republicans, right-wing zealots, got in there and they really hammered Cuba. I mean, hammered them, closed our embassy, stopped the cruise ships, stopped the flights, stopped the remittances, which were going into things like restaurants and auto shops and so forth. The Cubans were just, they were excited as heck about being capitalists and having a restaurant or having an auto shop or having a new auto or whatever. And we shut it all down. This is how your government works. I'm really sorry to give you so much insight into how your government works, but it is true.
We need it, Colonel Wilkerson. You know, the truth hurts, but we need to hear it. And so I thank you. I just want to turn it over to Amar. He has a question about your experience in the Bush administration. Amar, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yeah, speaking of Colonel Wilkerson, you just mentioned how our government works, and you having an inside view to that. You know, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question, but I guess the question is just, while you were Colin Powell's chief of staff, and while the administration was pushing for a war in Iraq and hawkish foreign policies and neoconservative foreign policies, I guess, could you just speak to a little bit about what was that whole experience like for you, from your perspective, when they were talking about things like weapons of mass destruction? I mean, you must have understood that Saddam Hussein was not a threat to the safety of people in America. So I don't know, could you just speak a little bit about your experiences from that time?
It was the worst time in my life. Certainly the worst time in my professional life as a military officer or member of the United States government or whatever. And it ruined the relationship between me and Colin Powell. By the time January 2005 came around, we weren't even speaking to each other. He'd go one way down the aisle and I'd go the other way down the aisle. If he had something he wanted to tell me, he'd send it through Marjorie, his executive assistant, or if I had something to tell him, I'd make sure my deputy, Peggy Sofrino, chief of staff, gave it to him. When he gave me an award at the end, you see a picture right back here on the wall of him giving me an award, the highest award the Secretary of State can give anyone. I walked out, put it in a drawer, and didn't look at it again. My wife told me, put the picture up. I really felt low. I felt as low as I'd ever felt in my life. And it wasn't just the Iraq War. It was having served an administration that would torture people. Those instructions for torture would come from the President of the United States. I was not naive. I knew the United States military had tortured thousands in the Philippines. I knew that we had, at the turn of the last century, I knew we had tortured people in Vietnam, but this was military gone awry. And there were courts and courts martial, and we did something about it. Never in our history has the President of the United States ordered other people in the world to be tortured. That happened in my administration. When I think about that, I still get angry. I still get angry at myself for not walking out the door. Of course, I didn't know it until I got to the end of 2004, when Powell had charged me after the Abu Ghraib photographs came out with finding out for him how we got there. And I didn't find out, I didn't complete my investigation until late in 2004. That's one of the reasons we weren't talking. because I thought I knew the truth. I've subsequently, because of good students on 2 campuses, George Washington University and William and Mary, discovered even more. And I'm debating right now whether or not I publish the some 1,000-page manuscript I've created, because it will really, really hurt a lot of people. I don't know whether I'm going to or not. I may go to my grave without having published it. It was a terrible time. I saw more than I saw in Vietnam as a soldier engaged in killing people for the state, more than I saw in any of my military education, more than I'd seen anywhere else, serving Admiral Bill Crow out in the Pacific, who later became chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staff and was a brilliant man. Operating at the highest levels of decision-making in the US government, I didn't see the rough side of empire, if you will, until George W. Bush and Dick Cheney came along. And it was all Colin Powell could do to deal with it. It was enervating. It was soul sapping. It was deadly. And you didn't know whether you were going to stick around. I wrote out my resignation several times and had long conversations with my wife. And she said, if you leave, he'll have no one there to protect him. You need to stay, and so forth. And at the end of the day, she probably was right, because it would have been not just disloyal, it would have been really, really selfish of me to think of my own reputation and my own conscience and so forth when I saw him racked almost every day, whether it was North Korea or it was Iran or it was China or it was Taiwan, or you name your issue. He was up against the vice president, the president, and the national security advisor, almost opposed completely on each of them. The only one he won on consistently was China, and that was to the credit of, or to the benefit of the United States, to be sure. But he won on that because George W. Bush knew the benefit of China to Walmart. He knew that without the Chinese producing, Walmart wouldn't exist, nor would half of the rest of American enterprise. So he knew that was important, and he backed Powell on that relationship. And he backed him on HIV/AIDS, which is why President Bush is revered in Africa even today. So there were some positive things, but most of it was just a almost existential fight every day. And that is really taxing. And then when you realize things like I just admitted, torture, that the president ordered the torture, and that we did the things we did with regard to the Middle East. I mean, just look at it from a rational point of view. We empowered Iran. We destroyed 2, 3, 4 countries. Obama came along and made it another one with Libya. And by the way, in that meeting in the White House in 2015, he literally apologized for Libya in front of John Kerry. He said his first words out of his mouth were, there's a bias in this town toward war. Let me say that again. There's a bias in this town toward war. I didn't think I'd ever hear a sitting president say that. And then he talked about how really he didn't know what to do about it. That's what every president faces. That's what every president will face more and more. We have to change that. We have to change that. So I've rambled a little bit. I rambled a lot, but it was a bad time. It was a tragic time for my country, for my beloved boss, and for the State Department. It was a tragic time.
Well, thank you for that answer. My follow-up here is for a group like Massachusetts Peace Action, which is limited in our resources. What do you think? What can we do to stop the destructive policies of the U.S. empire? Where are the pressure points in the U.S. empire that a group like Mass Peace Action can have an impact?
I get that question a lot, and I usually say something like this. For a time there, I was called the Quaker Colonel because I was spending so much time with FCNL, the Friends Committee for National Legislation, because They're one of the most powerful lobby groups I've ever encountered. And I put myself in with them every time I could for a long time, about a 5-year period. The most powerful thing they did was constituent visits. And they did it this way. They called every state in the union and they got a delegation. It might be 10, it might be 20, it might be 40 for some of the bigger states and some of the states that could afford to do what they were doing, send their people to Washington. Then they had a huge conference and they war gamed it. They got everybody on the same sheet of music with regard to the war power, with regard to spending, with regard to what was the other really big, well, the big issue became the Yemen war. And they said, go ye out to the Congress. You cannot refuse, if you're a senator or a representative, a constituent visit. If you're from Wisconsin, you better take that party from Wisconsin or you're going to pay for it. And they also had a way to make them pay for it if someone did have the gall to turn a visit down. Sometimes they'd postpone and the party would have to stay around longer and spend more money on hotels and so forth. But I never saw anything as powerful as that. Going into the congressman, the senator's office and telling them what you wanted, giving it to them in no uncertain terms, whether it's restoring constitutional war power or it's stopping U.S. support. We got the vote in both houses for stopping U.S. support for the war in Yemen. Trump vetoed it. Senate passed it, House passed it, but Trump vetoed it. And frankly, there were not enough courageous congressmen to override that veto. Most of them wanted to, even the hardcore Republicans that we had the most difficulty with, and even people like Steny Hoyer and Nancy Pelosi, they were against it too. They didn't want it to happen. Oh, they prated about how they were against it. But when it came time to do it, when it came time to cast your vote, they didn't vote for it because they're in the complex too. Both sides are in the complex. And they're in the Saudi, the sort of Saudi grip too. But we did get the vote. And if Trump hadn't been the president, I think we would have got it. And that would have started the unwinding of all the authorizations for the use of military force. The one post 9/11 is still in effect. We're fighting a war all across the world, 29 countries, under that authorization for the use of military force. That's nonsense. Congress needs to revoke that. So that's the most powerful way. Telephone calls are good, letters and emails are good, but boy, that constituent visit is really powerful.
Yep, and I just want to say that we do work closely with FCNL and their groups here in Massachusetts and the local Friends meetings. Some of the best anti-war peace folks around. I couldn't agree with you more, Colonel Wilkerson. I'm glad you raised the issue of Yemen. I know it seems far afield from the subject of Russia and China, but I think it does connect with this whole rules-based order that Biden is building his foreign policy around, these norms and also the human rights framework that he is championing, at least rhetorically. We're worried about what's happening in Yemen right now. We're worried that despite the fact that President Biden said in February that he's going to end the war in Yemen, we continue to support offensive operations by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. We continue to work on the fighter jets that are bombing day in and day out. We are beginning to pursue a strategy of war powers again, because of its privileged nature, because it puts the spotlight on this issue, and frankly, because of how bad the humanitarian situation is in Yemen. Do you believe that, as it did in the last Congress under President Trump, that war powers should still be brought up by the U.S. Congress to prevent the continued support of offensive operations in Yemen by the United States?
I do, just to make the point. But here's what I got in a briefing yesterday. I hope it's accurate. I hope it's true. I corroborated it at least through some contacts in Oman. Oman is probably the best state in the Levant for offering good offices. And that's just a diplomatic term. That means they expedite negotiations and they do it marvelously well. The old Sultan was tremendously good at it, and it looks like the new power structure is working well too. There's some things happening. First of all, you probably know this, Iran and Saudi Arabia are talking. The Emirates are in there, a little Sparta, others too, but Oman's expediting these talks, as are some other countries. Kuwait, I'm told, is involved also. They understand that even Trump was not willing to go the full protect Saudis at any cost route, no matter his sword dance and all that. He didn't do a lot. I think one of the things he did, one of the reasons he assassinated Qasem Soleimani was because he wanted to change that appearance, but it didn't work. So the Saudis are looking for other ways to protect themselves. Second thing is they've lost the war. The Houthis have won. The Saudis have finally recognized that, I was told. They have. Mohammed bin Salman has actually recognized that. He was the guy who started the whole thing in the first place. Third thing is the Houthis leadership has let it be known that their conditions are A, B, C, D, and so forth. And the Saudis have said, as long as you allow us to leave a few troops in the region that is most contested along our border to make sure that nobody comes in and riles up our population, we'll probably accept those things. And there are other things that have happened too. But it's looking more positive right now for political settlement and a first step lifting the naval blockade than it has since everything started, in my view. It could go haywire in a moment. I think a lot of it depends on the talks between Tehran and Riyadh. But I'm positive, I'm optimistic a bit for the first time in this whole mess since the thing started. Fixing Yemen is going to be a major, major problem, though. And unlike, well, I won't say unlike, but maybe I should say like most such calamities, everybody's attention will come off as soon as the children stop dying and the starvation and the cholera under control and so forth. And that'll be a positive if it happens. But then, you know, look at Yemen's history, the North and the South, the constant battles, the tribes and so forth. Do you ever fix that problem entirely? But I think stopping the conflict and stopping the killing and stopping the starvation and fighting the cholera and so forth is definitely a positive. And we should all encourage that and cheer when it happens, if it happens. Further than that, I don't know how you go. Let me tell you what we did in Doha virtually about 3 weeks ago. I was invited to their climate change webinar. I was invited to comment and listen and so forth and so on. I belong to the Climate Security Working Group here in Washington, which is mostly DOD, DHS, FEMA, and so forth. We are the only real federal entity that recognizes significant threat from climate change. I should say that again because it ought to shock you. We're working on the Congress, we're working on other people within the federal government. Biden has changed things a bit. He's brought Obama's policies back and even emphasized them more so. He's got a Secretary of Defense that says, I have 3 priorities: China, climate change, and what was the other one? I can't remember. It begins with C too, but climate change was there. I don't know how much that means, but I do know that the military is the lead federal bureaucracy on combating climate change, both in terms of adaptation and amelioration, which means stopping all the greenhouse gases going up into the atmosphere. All that to say that what's happening with regard to climate change needs to happen globally. And I hope that was part of the conversation at the G7, the NATO summit, and elsewhere. It needs to happen globally. We need to have people beginning to deal with that, because if we don't, we're in real trouble. Many of the scientists with whom we consult in the CSWG on a routine basis, from NASA, from RAND, from other places, think it's too late. That's the truth of it. It's too late. That we're going to suffer catastrophic climate change, that by mid-century, we will have an entirely different planet. By the end of the century, we'll have over 500 million, perhaps 1 billion refugees if they aren't killed in the previous days. And the peer powers, who will be the last to be hit, the global south will be first probably, will be the last to be hit, but we're already being hit. Look at the fires, look at the hurricanes, look at the devastation, the drought in the Southwest and so forth. We're already being hit, but we will not get the full effects of it until late in the century. And we'll put machine guns and troops on the border and shoot people. That's the reality of it, because there will be so many people trying to get where there is potable water, where there is some food, where there is something of a prospect. And a lot of them will be young men, and a lot of them will be carrying AKs with at least 20 rounds of ammunition. The things we're seeing at the border right now are just a forerunner. Think about that for a minute. There are about 170 million refugees in the world today. Think about 500 million. Think about 1 billion. That's what we're facing. If we don't get together and we don't cooperate on a global basis, and certainly domestically, we're going to be in trouble. I made a recommendation the other day that we have a CCC type organization, Franklin Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps, only it be a climate corps, and it have 2 to 4 million men and women in it. Draft them if necessary, conscript them if necessary. And these people are going to be the people who have to deal with the increasing effort to combat the effects of climate change, whether it's fires all across the West and increasingly in other regions of the country, whether it's drought. The military just declared, all the services just declared drought as the #1 threat climate change will produce. We thought it would be sea level rise because that's what we've been dealing with. Billions of dollars necessary to adapt places like San Diego, Norfolk, Charleston, Pascagoula, and so forth. We thought that would be on their top threat agenda, and it's high, but drought is their #1 because there are 200 installations in the US alone that are threatened by drought, directly or indirectly, because they're connected to their civilian communities. And if the civilian community is threatened, so is the military reservation. And it's not that different around the world either. Think about the South China Sea and the militarization of those atolls and little islands by China. So what? In 30 years, they'll be gone. They'll be underwater, just as Palau will be underwater, just as Kwajalein will be underwater. Long rambling story, but we've got a real challenge on our hands, perhaps the greatest challenge the planet and the human race have ever faced.
Brian, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
And I hate to do this, but I got another thing at 9.
Yeah.
So.
we're gonna leave it right there.
Okay, Mr. Busy.
This last word from the chat is: how can we cooperate globally on the climate catastrophe while continuing to challenge Russia and China? I'll answer that one. I don't think we can. It's
You're right.
Cooperation or co-annihilation. That's the choice that we're faced with. I want to thank you, Colonel Wilkerson, for spending so much time with us and for being so frank and upfront. I really appreciate that. I know the audience does. And I'm going to let you go right now so you can get to your next meeting at 9. I'm sorry to hold you for so long. I couldn't help myself. But
No,
I know our audience benefited from it.
Great questions. And I like talking to Americans who think.
Well, we like hearing from you, and we appreciate your honesty. I just can't say enough, but I will let you go with that, and just thank you so much.
Thank all of you for your great questions and your work.
So yeah, that was Colonel Larry Wilkerson, not pulling any punches whatsoever. It's refreshing to hear someone be so honest about not just the state of foreign policy today, but about his own direct experience and sort of, you know, he really opened up to us about the crucible of his own life and career there during the Bush administration. So we appreciate that. If you appreciated the conversation, why don't you consider joining Massachusetts Peace Action? We need your help. We need you to become a member, and really an active member of Massachusetts Peace Action. We need your help in planning programming like this, in organizing, in putting pressure on our congressional offices. Just like Colonel Wilkerson said, right? It makes a difference when you show up to their office, when you're calling them up on the phone, when you're making demands. Because the military-industrial complex, the big oil companies that are really causing climate change, they pay people to make those visits and to make those phone calls. Armies of them. What we have is people power, right? We have you. And we know that the people of this country are sick and tired of war, and that they want to change. That they see that the country is not going in a good direction, and they know that if we have a chance to battle climate change, if we have a chance to revamp our education system and to rebuild our infrastructure and to invest in the health of our people, we cannot continue to spend the amount that we do on the warfare state year after year after year after year. So we need to make a change, and we need to take our country back for the sake of our children and our grandchildren and generations to come. So it can't be about competition. It can't be about dominating the world. It needs to be about cooperation, brotherhood, sisterhood, siblingship, if we have any chance to solve these problems. So I encourage you, do what you can. Go to masspeaceaction.org, click join, become a member. You will have a voice. You will get to do some work. You'll have an impact. I know it because I lived it. And if you can spare a couple of dollars for us as well, we would love to have it. Because, you know, I just want to thank you again, because without an audience, we wouldn't get to do stuff like this. So we depend on you. We depend on volunteers, activists, advocates. We need you. So get more involved. And if you're viewing from another part of the country, look into your local Peace Action affiliate and join them too. Lots of other great groups too, like Code Pink, the Dissenters, FCNL that Lawrence Wilkerson mentioned. There's peace groups out there. Get involved, join an organization. We can make this change, but it's not going to be easy. But without hope, we don't have a chance. But from what I just heard and the insightful questions that we got from the audience, that gives me a lot of hope. So I just want to say thank you all for being in this struggle with us. And tomorrow we're going to be right back at it with another legend, Daniel Ellsberg, at 7 p.m. Watch out for your inbox. We're going to send you a link to register for that, a recording of this to share with your friends, and ways to get involved. And we really hope you do, because we can make a difference, but only if we do it together. So I know that sounds corny, but I believe it. So I love you all, and thanks for being a part of this with us. Yeah. Have a great night.